Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Peter Goddard, Director of the Institute. And it's a great pleasure for me to introduce this Friends Forum, and in particular to introduce Paul Hodgson. Paul received his Bachelor of Arts in Fine Art from the University of Newcastle upon Tyne, north of England, in 1995, and his Master's in Printmaking from the Royal College of Art in London in the year 2000. Over the past 10 years, his work has been featured in very many solo and group exhibitions in many countries, in New York, in Miami, in Rochester, New York, in Stockholm, in Riga, in Berlin, and many other places. Paul is represented by the Marlborough Fine Art Gallery in London, where he had a solo show last spring, which I was privileged to get to, featuring new work by him concurrently with the publication of The Cold Eye, in which he responded to poems by Dan Burt, who's also a former director's visitor here, and these poems are collected in Dan's book, Searched for Text, published 2 years ago. I believe some catalogues from this show at the Marlborough Gallery are available tonight. We're extremely pleased to have Paul here this term as a director's visitor, and without any further description, I will invite Paul to give his talk, Honest Doubt. Paul.
Can you just bring those lights down? Good evening. Before I begin, I would like to thank Peter Goddard and Pamela Hughes for inviting me to speak at this Friends Forum. It's both a pleasure and an honor. Thank you. My interest in doubt stems largely from my own feelings of doubtfulness. I am for the figure in art, but I'm doubtful about how to depict the human figure in my own work. I am for the thing itself, how a work is made. One thing, the surface, the image or language, pushed up against another. But I feel uncertainty over why one would lay down a drawn, painted, or photographic mark in the first place. I am for the thing itself and sensations beyond the four edges of the picture, and yet I feel doubtfulness about the reliability and the value of any single voice. The phrase honest doubt comes from Tennyson's In Memoriam A.H.H. And in the catalogue to an exhibition at Marlborough Fine Art London earlier this year, the poet Andrew Motion identifies this phrase as a possible epigraph to the show. He goes on to describe how the large scale and bold presentation of the figure lifts a group of 6 pictures towards a heroic scale and continues by writing, yet in each of the 6, what is conventionally regarded as heroic is countered by elements of doubtfulness, introspection, and anguish. By the close of the series, indeed, we have been required to think that heroism might in fact arise from the struggle to embrace the opposite. The first work in this group of 6 pictures, and the one we see here, is entitled Dormant Figure, and in brackets, Portrait of Martin Luther. It dates from 2008 to 2009, and it measures 210 centimeters or 82 inches in height. 2 things initially drew me to Luther as a subject. The first was the moral and intellectual courage that he displayed, such certainty of action, in nailing the 95 Thesis to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg in 1517, thereby initiating the Protestant Reformation. The second was a reproduction of an engraving by Cranach the Elder, dated 1520, that depicts Luther as a young monk. This image was produced as propaganda for the cause, but rejected on the grounds that the deep-seated eyes aroused suspicion amongst some. As windows into the soul of the sitter, did they reveal a man who was experiencing strange fantasies? A man whose eyes, according to the Polish diplomat Dantiskus von Hoffen, were, just like his books, sharp and glittering strangely, as in the case of possessed people. To my mind, the elements that sparked objection are exactly those that make the image so potent. Luther's focus appears to be double-edged, displaying both an admirable level of belief and a narrowness of vision, the latter being portrayed, perhaps, in Cranach's naive rendering of Luther's right eye. In taking Cranach's engraving as a source and reconstructing it in pale, bleached hues with thick, encrusted paint, my intention was to depict a head that had calcified, and by implication, the calcification of ideas within it. Is it this transformation from fluid to rigid that causes his arm to lie heavily on his leg? An arm that, although static, appears full of latent action. I can't tell you what this work, or indeed any of the works that I will show you, are about. Instead, I can try and communicate some of the thoughts that I was having at the time of making them, what my interests were, and what my intentions may have been, and how these may have influenced the decisions that I made. I'm in the habit of collecting my notes together in small books and A4 folders, which contain drawings, written ideas, printed material. And I file them in roughly chronological order. This enables me to go back and look at material that corresponds to a certain picture. But many decisions are, to a large extent, made instinctively and may appear without any concrete explanation. I can say that in Dormant Figure, it was my intention to form a dialogue between the word dormant in the title, the rendering of the head in thick, dry paint, the position of the left arm, its role in both the pose of the figure and the overall composition, and the inclusion of photographic information. It was my intention that the content of the work would lie within these physical elements, the manner in which they interact, and their relationship to the found image, in this case, Cranach the Elder's original portrait of Luther. This work is a collage both of painted and photographic material. The process of making it began by photographing a model in the studio. In this case, it was actually myself, and using the images to begin a full-size painting and a series of painted studies. These paintings were then photographed and digitally collaged onto an image of the model before being printed onto a separate canvas. Areas of the original full-size painting were then removed with a knife in order to incorporate sections of the digitally printed information. I then continued to paint on this new, essentially hybrid surface, sometimes scraping back to reveal, sometimes cutting away further sections in order to introduce more of the photographic source. Painting re-emerged in my work, along with the development of a mixed media approach, after a period of approximately 8 years, during which time I produced mainly photographically derived digital works. Slippage is one of these works and is the first in a series of 3 made in 2006 for an exhibition at the Imperial War Museum, London, commemorating the 90th anniversary of the Battle of the Somme. It's a digital pigment print on paper with acrylic varnish, mounted on aluminium, framed, and measures 1.8 meters or 70 inches in width. In The Culture of Time and Space, Stephen Kern describes the introduction of standard time at the end of the 19th century as the most momentous development in the history of uniform public time since the invention of the mechanical clock. In 1914, the world would go to war using mobilization timetables made possible by standard time. Advances in technology changed the nature of combat irreversibly, and the horrific aftermath of mechanized warfare demanded, in turn, a monumental shift in human consciousness. I was interested in the idea of a decisive shift and devised an image that would depict a physical jolt of some sort. At the time, I was drawn to an archive photograph of a collapsed horse in the streets of Paris during World War II. The incident had stopped a group of passers-by in their tracks, interrupting their everyday routine with spectacle. Beyond its role in indicating a time before and a time after the horse has fallen, a narrative reading of Slippage, although perhaps inevitable, is not, in my view, of great importance to the work. Instead, the image should focus upon a frozen moment, albeit staged, in which one thing violently becomes another. This, I believe, is the subject of the piece, as opposed to any attempt to communicate the changes in consciousness that I mentioned earlier. Having said that, I couldn't fail to recognize that the image of the fallen horse, with all of its inherent symbolism, could be read as a rather literal comment upon the end of horsepower. Train is the second work in this series. In this 2-panel piece, I wanted to take an object that belongs to a certain technological era, an untethered horse-drawn cart, and suggest its transformation into a mechanized unit, a unit that could be reproduced many times over. The load being carried by the cart on the right-hand side is a heap of sharp forms intended to be reminiscent of the forms that we find in Cubism and Futurism. Rather than attempting to express an emotive response to the atrocities of war, my aim in composing this area of the picture was to suggest a shift from one pictorial language to another, the type of shift that took place in the early part of the 20th century as artists strived to represent the fast-changing world around them. This is A Man with Guitar, circa 1912, by Braque. This area of the picture began as a drawing in charcoal and chalk, which was then photographed and digitally collaged into the photographic tableau. The final work in the series is entitled A Man Like Rosenberg. In the same year that I made the works for the War Museum, I accepted a commission from St. John's College, Cambridge, to produce an image of Bishop John Fisher. Fisher was chaplain to Lady Margaret Beaufort, grandmother to King Henry VIII, and following her death in 1509, Fisher oversaw the founding of St. John's College. In 1534, Fisher was sent to the Tower of London for refusing to take an oath of succession, acknowledging the legitimacy of Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn. It was here, in 1535, after stating his belief that the king was not, nor could be, by law of God, supreme head in earth of the Church of England, that Fisher was executed by beheading. St. John's College owned several paintings of Fisher, but it was felt by Professor Richard Perham, master at the time, and several of the fellows, that a drawing by Hans Holbein the Younger, dated circa 1532 to 34, and in the Royal Collection, offered the desired image of the bishop. I was provided with a photograph of the drawing and asked to create a contemporary interpretation. I began by choosing a model with a similar facial type and literally dressed him up like Fisher. In the stage of the process that you see here, I'd begun to morph the features of the model into the drawing. So working with translucent layers, I could use the drawing as a guide while manipulating the features of the actor that I'd chosen for the part. When all of the layers are at 100% opacity or strength, the photograph of the model is oversaturated and heavy in tone. And this is so that when the opacity is reduced and parts of the drawing show through, the two elements create a sense of realism. I wanted the finished work to appear independent of the drawing, to have its own physical presence that belongs to the photographic and the digital age. To these ends, I erased as much of the drawing as possible. However, I was dissatisfied with the hat that I'd photographed initially, and in its place decided to bring through the hat from Holbein's drawing. But the two didn't make pictorial sense. So I made a number of paintings of the hat, photographed the paintings, and then incorporated them into that digital collage. In order to further tie the elements of the picture together, I photographed a piece of unprimed linen and then placed the texture of the weave over the whole image at a scale relative to the 84 centimeters or 33 inches in height that the finished work would be. The final stages were concerned with further manipulations of color and tonality, and with preserving elements of the drawing that seemed of particular importance, such as the perimeter of the nostril and the line that defines the mouth. This is an image of the finished work. It's entitled Bishop John Fisher, dated 2007. It's a digital pigment print with acrylic on canvas, and it's now hanging in the Master's Lodge at St John's College, Cambridge. Many of the figures in my recent work appear on the edge of action. Or to quote Motion again, they catch their sitters at a moment of penultimacy. Difficulties in making a judgment and doubtfulness in choosing one thing over another underlie my current practice and emerge both in the way that I fabricate the work and the images that I choose to present. In Binary, completed in 2009, I intended doubtfulness to permeate both the pose of the figure portrayed, the thinness of the gestural area of paint behind him, and the fact that, unable to settle upon a single style, I moved from painterly gesture, a thin scraping of paint, to photographic material, to thick encrusted pigment. At the time of making this picture, I was thinking about the German playwright Bertolt Brecht's theory of epic theatre. Brecht proposed that a play should not cause the audience to identify emotionally with the characters or the action before them, nor aim to produce the emotional climaxes that would have a cathartic effect upon the audience, thus leaving them complacent. Instead, he wished to employ techniques that remind the spectator that a play is merely a representation of reality by highlighting the constructed nature of the theatrical event. One of Brecht's most important principles can be called his defamiliarization effect, from which I identified and adapted the following. The use of isolated elements, treating each part of a play independently, for example, an individual scene, as if nothing is going to follow it. Pluralism. Actors were to play characters believably, but without convincing the audience or themselves that they had become the characters. Choice. The choices that the actors make should be explicit and can be reflected in their dialogue. For example, I could have stayed in the village, but instead I traveled to the city. In choosing the pose for the figure in Binary, which was influenced in part by a sequence from the 1920 German expressionist film Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, I wanted to suggest the moment before a decision is made, a decision that might serve to separate two forms, two ideas, perhaps rendering one dark and one light. The figure's classical-looking head was deliberately chosen as a reference to antiquity and was prompted by my interest in the Italian humanist, historian and statesman Leonardo Bruni, 1369 to 1444. Of particular interest was his decision to label the period between the fall of the classical world and his own time as the Dark Ages. In doing so, he heralded a third age in which antiquity would be reborn to restore classical purity. A third and modern age that would embody hope for the renovation of culture through art, science, and technology, and create law from the sludge of barbarism. Having said this, it was not, however, my intention to make an overt reference to this historical subject, or indeed to make a history painting. My aim, rather, was to form a generic subject from a decisive moment in history, a subject that could be represented through the arrangement of pictorial elements, a subject that does not require either an historical text or an implied narrative in order to be appreciated. In terms of history painting, Dormant Figure, Portrait of Martin Luther, probably comes closest to this genre through my having identified the subject of the picture in the title. It does not, however, depict an important event from history or mythology, such as Luther actually nailing his 95 Theses to the castle door, which would have qualified it as a history painting. Treating different areas of a picture as if they exist in isolation and employing a diversity of styles are both strategies that I used in the making of Cathedra, a relatively large work, 205 by 170 centimetres, roughly 80 by 67 inches, which dates from 2009. The word cathedra, spelt with a C, is the Latin for chair, and is used to describe the chair or throne of a bishop. Its origin is the Greek word cathedra, spelt with a K, meaning seat. As a title for this piece, I chose Cathedra with a K. Once again, we move from photographic material to gestural paint to thick and pastel. But do any of these have value when one is pushed up against another in the same picture? The head of the figure is based upon a copper engraving by Albrecht Dürer, dated 1524, that depicts Willibald Pirkheimer, 1470 to 1530, a German Renaissance lawyer, a Renaissance humanist, and a contemporary of Luther. When I transported this image into my own picture, I didn't feel it was necessary to identify the figure as Pirkheimer, as it was not my intention to produce a portrait as such, and because my interest in Dürer's engraved image lay mainly in its suggestive nature. And what can I say about this suggestive nature? What did I want this head to communicate? Faith in our endeavours to build a platform, a single voice, something to counter the uncertainty that results from human beings becoming a subject with assumed lordship over a universe of objects. But this is too much to place at the door of an image of a human head, and in fact, too much to the place at the threshold of any picture. So I began by thinking about the rectangle of the picture as one of action, a space in which the subjective view of an individual could be exalted and become a new truth, like the gestural web in Willem de Kooning's Untitled 19 from 1977. I wanted that space to end up, however, as one that undermines itself, for the head to look out of place, or perhaps in the wrong time, positioned as it is on top of a figure dressed in contemporary clothing. For the pose of the figure, the barely functional furniture, and the insubstantial rendering of the view through a window, to destabilize the space in which I have placed this head, and by implication, prevent the suggestion of faith, which first attracted me to Dürer's engraving of Pirkheimer, from being transferred to my contemporary scene. The legitimacy of this new pictorial space to act as a platform for oration should appear questionable. even though the deliberate placement of the figure's fist just off center could suggest that the picture quite literally revolves around him. I started to use doubt, my own feelings of doubt, as a subject in my work while I was an undergraduate student in the Fine Art Department at the University of Newcastle upon Tyne. This is a work from 1994. It's entitled Reunion, The Odor of Burning Vegetation. I sometimes went in for rather pretentious titles in those days. And I hope they've got better, but I don't think I'm the best judge. It measures 178 centimeters by 422 centimeters, so it's roughly 70 inches in height by 166 inches in width. On the left-hand side of the work, I placed a selection of images, some of which are figurative, some of which are abstract textures or forms derived from everyday objects. I thought of these as potential narrative elements that could take their place within a sequence of events that would in turn constitute a pictorial narrative. The various ways in which I've recorded these elements on the surface of the canvas are joined together by one common factor: a distrust in laying down a direct mark. The elements that I have chosen are presented through the use of collage, monotype, screen print, through the pouring of paint and the smearing of paint, but rarely through the use of a signature mark with the aid of a brush. They are second and third hand, layered and fragmented. In the right-hand side of the work, a selection of these potential narrative elements have been extracted, simplified in both form and color, and cut out of a rigid material. They now take their place in a line, suggesting a left-to-right reading with a beginning and an end, a narrative of sorts, or at least the skeleton of a narrative, a grey, washed-out impression. Why choose one set of elements instead of another, and one narrative order out of many? This was the question that I attempted to address in another undergraduate work, this time from the following year, from 1995. The work consisted of a group of photographic images mounted onto panels, each one approximately 18 centimeters or 7 inches square, and hung on pegs that appear at regular points on a wooden grid. This wasn't exactly a kinetic work. I didn't encourage the viewer to move the panels. But the implication was that this particular arrangement was only one solution amongst many. In the summer of 2008, I approached a poet named Dan Burt, who Peter mentioned in the introduction, with an idea to collaborate on a book. We decided that I would choose 10 poems that he had already written and use them as a starting point for the project. My intention was not to illustrate the poems, but rather to produce a group of images in which I would respond to certain themes and ideas expressed within them. Some of these themes touched upon my own interests, and in several cases I was able to use as source material found images that had been in the studio for several years. To avoid the finished works being linked an overtly narrative reading, I decided to title them as Untitled 1 through to Untitled 10, with the title of the poem appearing in brackets afterwards and mainly as identification only. This is Untitled 1 and in brackets after Ishmael. In working with text and image, we intended for one to explore the other. The text, while remaining entirely self-sufficient, should influence our reading of the image and reveal something about its genesis. The image, while existing as an independent work, should suggest new ways of approaching the corresponding poem. As the project developed, a format for the book evolved in which the title of the poem appeared, followed by the poem in full, followed by 2 pages of fragments, both of text and image, before the full image was revealed alongside the full poem. This time, the poem is printed onto drafting film, so that when you bring the page over and reveal the image, the poem is the right way around to read. This build-up was engineered in order to reveal something of the process of making or thinking through the book. In that way, the manner in which the book is put together is part of its subject matter. Title of the finished book is Cold Eye. The Roman theologian St. Augustine believed free choice or free will to be a necessary condition for virtuous action. Adam's guilt, or original sin, transmitted to his descendants, diminishes but does not destroy the freedom of their will. The French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre saw freedom as a necessary condition for action. To act is to act consciously, having recognized that the present situation could be altered in some way. Action, therefore, negates the given, or the present. Freedom, however, can be lost if we fail to recognize that a situation could be altered and that we, given an appraisal of our abilities, can and should affect that change. The idea of losing freedom through inaction was coupled in my mind with doubts about the value of a subjective response. This coupling became the basis for several pictures. I decided to form a pictorial environment for a single figure from my subjective response to landscape. Beginning with photographs of various woodland scenes, I made a series of drawings and small paintings that served as studies for the landscape elements that would appear in 2 larger works. In this fashion, the apparently expressive landscape-derived areas in Untitled Yellow, Grey and Red and Untitled Green and Blue, both made in 2009, are in fact rehearsed through a series of preliminary works. The poses of the 2 figures are intended to portray inactivity, a willingness to remain exactly where they are. The landscape elements appear to emanate from within, and I wanted both the facial expressions and the body language of the 2 individuals to communicate an acceptance of these seemingly subjective forms. But I also wanted this acceptance to appear misguided due to it being undermined both by the pluralistic manner in which the image has been made, painted marks against photographic and digital information, and the disingenuous nature of these apparently expressive landscape elements. The titles Untitled Green and Blue and Untitled Yellow, Grey and Red were chosen in order to draw attention to the subjective nature of labelling. The description offered by the title remains one of opinion. Are these the most important colours that make up the two respective pictures? And do they have more meaning attached to them than any of the other colours that are present? Or, for that matter, any of the other colours that I could have chosen to include in these pictures? The same could also be asked of the forms that surround the two solitary figures. While making an untitled work, completed this summer, indecision over how to make a mark and where to place that mark, uncertainty about its value as a subjective response, and doubtfulness about the value of distortion were at the front of my mind. Even though one could describe this as a figurative painting, not all of the emergent shapes create recognizable forms. I was trying to make an image appear like a thin film, like a scraping. I wanted to achieve this through my choice of painted marks rather than through a literal scraping of the surface, using the indecisiveness of these marks to indicate a space that is not fully formed or that is moving away from having been fully formed. At the same time, and perhaps in opposition to this apparent indecision, the pose of the figure is bold and almost kinetic, an impression that is reinforced by the energetic brushstrokes used in part to convey it. When one leg almost kicked up into the air, the pose may appear vaguely comical, as if while the top half of the body relaxes in a seated position, the bottom half is performing the can-can. In attempting to create an image that appeared thin, I was reminded of a quote by the American painter Willem de Kooning. Content is a glimpse of something, an encounter like a flash. It's very tiny content. The head of the figure is established with rather thin paint and with relatively rapid brushstrokes. It contrasts in this way with the treatment of the head in my depiction of Martin Luther and demonstrates my wish to avoid a consistent style. Thoughts about content should dictate, to a large extent, the decisions that are made in creating a picture, with the appearance of a work being dependent upon what exactly I wish to communicate. This may sound obvious, but I'm not sure that it is. What I'm attempting to achieve is a certain economy of means through which content can be communicated. I want the fabric of the picture to expose the decisions that have been made in the process of making it. At the same time, this economy of means should remain sufficiently open to the anomalous nature of the creative process. There must be ample room for invention, for improvisation. As much as I wish to promote pluralism in the work and use it to examine the value of a subjective response, I do not want the finished work to appear as merely an arrangement of symbols, waiting to be decoded by the viewer. In Dormant Figure, the depiction of Luther's head contains elements of a psychological portrait, offering an insight into the mind of the sitter, while at the same time, one could describe it as being emblematic because of the way in which it acts as a symbol for ideas of faith and devotion. The head of the figure in binary could also be interpreted as an emblem, but it offers little in the way of a psychological portrait, and instead takes its place alongside other objects in the picture. Similarly, when painting the head of the figure in Untitled in 2010, I wasn't interested in depicting an individual as such, more of a type. To my mind, this head is not emblematic in the same way as the heads in either binary or Dormant Figure. The thinness of the paint used and its cursory rendering makes this face more of a mask. As a means to gain further insight into human nature, Danish philosopher Kierkegaard promoted, alongside rhetoric, the use of irony. It could be argued that because of its entry into mainstream culture, the effectiveness of irony has gradually diminished from its various high points during the last century. There are, however, certain tools in art and literature from the first half of the 20th century that, to my mind, continue to be effective in the pursuit of further insight. Some of these I mentioned earlier when discussing Brecht's Defamiliarization Effect. In The Balcony, written in 1957, the French dramatist Jean Genet, we see the clients of a brothel indulge their fantasies by emulating roles of power in society: judge, bishop, and general. Meanwhile, a revolution is progressing outside in the city, killing all of the real holders of power except the chief of police. Under his command, the clients' roles are realized when they pose in public as the figures of authority, in a counter-revolutionary effort to restore order and the status quo. The Balcony is a meta-drama that engages us through the dramatization of events while simultaneously revealing its own artifice. The work that I've been developing over the last few years could be described as a form of meta-painting or meta-image making. Work that attempts to communicate content by revealing its own artifice. Content that is, in itself, attempting to express doubtfulness over certain assumed ideas that help propagate this artifice in the first place. I would like to reach a point at which I consistently fail to provide a happy ending. Not as an affectation, because I don't actually think it's in my nature. I like to please people, but as something that is absolutely integral to the finished work. I would like the inclusion of historical references within the work and the placing of work within an historical context to be pitted against the desire to strip away extraneous reference and for the work to be self-sufficient. In short, for the work to be the thing itself. Thank you. Certainly.
Paul is willing to answer some questions. Questions? Please, sir.
Well, I just wanted to ask you about scale, because you work on quite a large scale. You're interested in questions of doubt, and that seems kind of curious to me. I imagine somehow the precarious or smaller
Certainly.
might address doubt more.
That's a good point. Oh, yes. Well, Joe just asked me a question that I'm dealing with ideas of doubt and uncertainty, and yet the work is normally on a large scale, which perhaps seems to be contrary to my claiming that I'm doubtful. Well, I would say that it's one of the contradictions in the work, and a conscious one, in terms of, I'm interested, for example, in my own sense of uncertainty of why to put anything down in the first place, and yet I'm still driven to do it. And I think that I'm drawn to do something on a larger scale rather than a smaller scale, to perhaps overemphasize, to play upon the grandiose, and to try and relate in the work, to make reference to, I suppose, a grand tradition of image making and painting, but then infiltrate the midst of that hallowed space with my own sense of uncertainty and the questions that underlie the work, essentially.
My question's similar. You were talking about your backgrounds being disingenuous, and by the marks kind of seeming haphazard. Oh, sorry. You were talking about your backgrounds being disingenuous by the way that the marks seemed to be somewhat haphazard, and yet they were intentional.
Well, yes, I see the disingenuous nature being inherent in the fact that there's often a rehearsal. So what I mean in that respect by disingenuous is that if you look at the painting, it seems to be expressive and emotive, as if it's somehow come from the artist's gut. But in actual fact, what I often do is, I've recently exhibited the drawings as well, so that you can see that in actual fact, I worked out a lot of those marks quite carefully beforehand. And in fact, what looks like an explosive mark on the painting relates to a charcoal mark that was made several weeks before. And I've copied that, although it looks as if this is the outpouring of an emotional state, I'm responding to something in quite a controlled manner.
Well, it seems more to be a commitment than doubt, then, I guess, a commitment to an idea.
That's an interesting point. Yes, but I suppose it's somewhat paradoxical because I'm not able, if I was truly committed, I would just commit. Now, to rehearse, yes, it shows commitment, but it shows a lack of confidence. And I suppose it's the relationship between the two. Why do the drawings exist? Why, when you study the surface of the work, are some of the supposedly expressive marks actually photographically reproduced expressive marks, which then have to live with, are married together with actual gestural painting in the same work. There are quite a lot of contradictions, and some of it is quite intentional. It's a sense of not having, and I don't in any way mean this as a cop-out. I mean in terms of admitting that I don't have all the answers of how to put something down. And I mean, I mentioned before about not having a consistent style and finding these contradictions of real interest that I simply don't have any answers. I don't think there are any. I think that one can do things and respond, and that, in essence, that's all we are doing. The same as the scale, you see. I mean, I think, well, Why not do something large? I'm here, I'm doing it, I'll do something large. It doesn't mean it has any more meaning than if I did something small. I may do something small next year. Who knows?
Maren?
I would like to suggest that your subject of this evening is not really doubt, but the ironical use of the word economy. The number of references to the history of art is like a waterfall of every possible approach to the two-dimensional surface and beyond, excluding your own commentary. You have not incorporated your own commentary, which seems to me an integral part of your presentation of the objects that we must accept as part of the creative act.
My own commentary, you're saying that I haven't provided context for that commentary, or?
You haven't articulated your own vision of yourself, because to see your work of art and to hear your own analysis adds a dimension that is quite out of the ordinary and has nothing to do with doubt.
Well, I do think there's doubt in there. I do think that, but I think that I think that my actions in the studio in producing the work may seem to be quite certain enough. I mean, I'm getting on with it, and I'm finding strategies to work with. But I would argue that those strategies are unstable in themselves, that they don't show any commitment to a long-term plan, and that they are strategies that are, in essence, attempting to overcome my own inertia. The waterfall of historical references, to use your phrase, has been gushing for some time now, and it's interesting. I have a love-hate relationship with it, I must admit. I find that I am drawn to the complexity and the sheer beauty of ideas that are contained within not only the history of art, but various areas of human activity. But at the same time, I think, as I described at the end of the piece, I would like the work to be entirely self-sufficient. I'd like it to merely be the thing that it is itself. And it may be that, and I'm very aware of this, that my reliance on history at some points may be covering up my real deepest fears, and that it's only when I get over the other side, when I say, well, I'm going to leave all those things out, that I really find out what the work is about. It's interesting to me that people don't think that there's real doubt in what I'm presenting. And I mean, I may go away and have a crisis now. I don't know. What can I say? I mean, you know.
It would seem to me that doubt is integral to your creativity, your creative process. The doubt is integral to your.
Yes.
You need that almost. I can't imagine not having doubt when you're doing something creative.
Well, I don't think I've known what it's like to make work without doubt since I was a teenager. So it's just something that I find is, I suppose, part of my nature, and I've decided to work with it rather than try and be something that I'm not. And I use it, I suppose, as a small, something to grab onto, something to bring together what could otherwise be relatively disparate forms over choosing work from 15, 16-year period. But now I'm quite interested in the fact that I might have doubt about doubt. So, and I think that may be meta doubt. That's good, because Duchamp said that his irony was that of indifference. It was meta-irony. So maybe I've got uncertainty about doubt. I don't know. I mean, these are interesting questions. Yes.
I am thinking that perhaps a little bit what's going on is what Sir Laurence Olivier did when he was learning a part, and apparently he would play it in the largest possible way, trying all sorts of things relative to that character, so that he would be free to respond when it was necessary to something new in front of him. And I have the sense, you're very interested in theater, and I have the sense that you're going back to the past as part of that. You learn what other people were thinking, how they approached their work. And you're all set to respond if something happens in front of you. You know, try it, you can react to it.
Well, I think that that it's true in regards to, well, I don't know what position I should take. I mean, I don't know if I pick up a camera or a brush, what should I do? What guiding force is there? And if I'm purely to listen to my own whim and fancy, then who's to say why does that have any validity whatsoever? And so I think there is a sense of immersing myself in activity which has already taken place in different forms, from theatre to film to painting, and synthesizing those, and for those forms to come out in various ways, and to use those as quite literally material for the work. So I think perhaps that links in some respect to Marilyn's point about this waterfall of history and reference. And where am I in that? Where is my commentary? And I mean, maybe perhaps I'm not there. But I'm not saying that you were saying that, Marilyn, but it's making me think that, and I don't know if I'd mind that, to be honest, because, I mean, what a wonderful thing if you made things but you weren't actually there. That would be rather good, wouldn't it? You could just leave the things. There's a story, I'll just tell you a very interesting anecdote, you may know it, about when Laurence Olivier and Dustin Hoffman were working on, it's Marathon Man, isn't it, about the diamonds. The scene where Dustin Hoffman is running around Central Park, get rid of his demons. He's got so many things on his mind, he's being chased, etc. Both psychologically and physically. And before these scenes, when he used to have to be out of breath and he used to be tense, he would run around and around. And then he'd come back in and he'd literally be panting. He'd be ready for the scene. I'm ready now, I'm ready now. And this went on and on. And apparently Olivier once said to him, he said, my dear boy, he said, why don't you just act?
That's a good point to interrupt the discussion whilst we still have some confidence that they're still here.
Sure.
Sure. Thank Paul for his very interesting.
Thank you.